I never expected my life to change so profoundly on a night shift. I had worked in a hospital for many years, and my nights were usually filled with the quiet hum of monitors, the soft beeping of machines, and the gentle murmur of nurses sharing whispered confidences during brief moments of respite. But on that eerie autumn evening, everything I thought I knew about the ordinary and the mundane was shattered by an encounter that defied explanation. I was on duty in the seldom-used East Wing, a part of the hospital that rarely saw visitors and was reserved for patients with long-term or palliative care. The corridors were dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering in a way that sent uneasy shivers down my spine. I remember the moment vividly. As I made my rounds, I caught a glimpse of a figure at the far end of the corridor. At first, I thought it was a fellow staff member, but as I approached, I realized that the figure belonged to no one I recognized. He was clad in a well-worn suit that looked decades out of fashion, his face partly obscured by shadows, his eyes distant yet deeply sorrowful. An inexplicable chill ran down my spine, and in that moment, I sensed that something was terribly amiss. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if he were gliding rather than walking, and every step he took left me more perplexed and fearful. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed him down the hall, my footsteps echoing softly on the cold linoleum. In the silence, I could hear my own breathing, a rapid staccato that echoed the frantic beat of my heart. I tried to convince myself that I was merely tired, that the long hours and endless demands of the night shift had conjured a figment of my imagination. But the sight of his mournful eyes, which flickered with an ancient sadness, told me that this was no mere illusion. The mysterious man led me to a secluded room at the end of the hall, where the air felt heavier than usual, as if burdened by the weight of memories and unspoken stories. I hesitated at the doorway, my hand hovering over the cold metal handle, before finally summoning the courage to enter. Inside, the room was shrouded in an ethereal glow, a faint luminescence that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that was both magnetic and foreboding. I felt as though I were stepping into a world that existed on the border between life and death, a realm where the living dared not tread. There, in the center of the room, sat an old wooden chair that creaked with every slight movement, and beside it lay a faded newspaper clipping pinned to the wall. The article told the tragic tale of a man who had been a patient in the hospital many years ago, a kind, gentle soul whose life had been cut short by a mysterious illness that no one could fully understand. According to the faded ink and brittle paper, he was known as Mr. Henry Caldwell, a man of quiet dignity and profound regret. I felt an inexplicable pull, as if his story was intertwined with my own destiny. I began to recall whispered rumors among the staff, a tale of a man whose spirit never left the hospital, who roamed the halls at night seeking solace for unresolved pain. I wondered if the figure I had seen was, in fact, Mr. Caldwell. The notion chilled me more than any physical cold could, yet an inner compulsion urged me to uncover the truth behind this spectral visitor. Over the next several weeks, I found myself drawn to the East Wing night after night. I made sure to linger in that secluded room, quietly observing any sign of his presence, while grappling with my own swirling emotions of fear, curiosity, and empathy. Late one night, when the hospital was especially quiet and the sound of my own footsteps seemed to be the only living sound in the corridors, I saw him again. The figure of Mr. Caldwell appeared as if summoned by my unspoken plea. This time, he did not vanish into the darkness. Instead, he moved slowly toward me with an air of hesitant familiarity. I could almost feel his sorrow through the fabric of my own heart. Though I trembled, I knew I must speak. My voice, unsteady yet resolute, broke the silence. "Who are you?" I asked, my words barely a whisper as they dissolved into the stale air. He paused, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that was both heart-wrenching and hauntingly gentle. "I am a remnant," he said, his voice echoing like a distant melody, a soft, mournful tune that stirred memories of loss and regret. I am bound to this place by the chains of my past, unable to rest until my story is finally told. In that moment, I realized that I was not merely witnessing a ghostly apparition, but rather encountering a soul trapped between worlds, a spirit yearning for resolution. The days that followed were a blur of clandestine meetings and hushed conversations with a presence that defied the laws of nature. Each encounter was laden with a weight of untold sorrow, a lingering regret that clung to the spirit like a shroud. I began to piece together the fragments of his past, learning that Mr. Caldwell had been a man of honor who had made grave mistakes, his life marred by choices that had haunted him until his last breath. His family had long since departed from the hospital, and his memory had faded into obscurity, leaving behind only whispers of a legacy he never intended to leave. Night after night, I would sit in that quiet room, recounting the details of his life as if narrating a long-forgotten story to a friend. I discovered that his final hours had been spent in quiet despair, a silent, agonizing struggle against the inexorable pull of his own guilt. The hospital had been his sanctuary, a place where he had hoped to find redemption even as his body betrayed him. Yet death had come unbidden, leaving him with a burden too heavy to cast aside. The more I learned, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not only to help his spirit find peace, but also to honor the memory of a man whose life had been so full of love and regret. As weeks turned into months, my interactions with Mr. Caldwell evolved from fleeting, ghostly encounters to a deep, almost tangible connection. I began to document everything, scribbling notes in a worn journal that I kept hidden beneath my uniform. I recorded his words, his silent sighs, the shifting patterns of his spectral presence. I noticed that the hospital itself seemed to transform in his presence. Corridors that once felt sterile and impersonal now pulsed with an undercurrent of emotion. Every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind through cracked windows laden with significance. I learned to interpret these signs as messages from a spirit whose soul was desperate to be understood. One particularly stormy night, when the wind howled outside and the rain battered the windows with relentless fury, I encountered him in a way that forever altered the course of my life. The hospital was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass. I was returning from a particularly exhausting shift when I felt a cold presence brush past me in the corridor. I turned, and there he was, standing at the end of the hall, his form barely discernible against the darkness. In that moment, as the storm raged outside, I saw something in his eyes that I would never forget. A profound sadness, a silent plea for redemption that resonated with every fiber of my being. I mustered every ounce of courage I had and approached him. "Tell me your story," I said, my voice trembling but sincere. His lips parted slowly, and the air around us seemed to thicken with the weight of his memories. For what felt like an eternity, he began to recount the tale of his life, a narrative filled with moments of both deep sorrow and unexpected tenderness. He spoke of a lost love, of promises broken and dreams deferred. I listened, utterly captivated, as he described the intricate tapestry of his life, a life that had been defined by moments of both triumph and heart-wrenching failure. He recounted the days of his youth, when hope was abundant and the future shimmered with possibilities. He spoke of the laughter he shared with his beloved wife, of the quiet evenings spent by the fire, and of the simple joys that now seemed so far removed from his present state of despair. Yet, amidst these recollections of love and warmth, there was an undercurrent of regret, a persistent feeling that something precious had been lost forever. The hospital, in all its sterile isolation, had become a monument to his unfulfilled dreams, a place where the echoes of his past reverberated in every shadowed corner. As the storm subsided and the first light of dawn began to creep through the hospital windows, I found myself questioning the very nature of reality. Was I truly conversing with a ghost, or was this a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and grief? The lines between the tangible and the intangible had blurred to the point where it was nearly impossible to tell them apart. Yet, the sincerity in his voice, the undeniable emotion in his eyes, assured me that he was more than a mere figment of my imagination. In the days that followed, I embarked on a personal quest to piece together the remnants of Mr. Caldwell's past. I scoured old hospital records, spoke in hushed tones with long-retired staff, and even sought out distant relatives who might recall the man who had once walked these very halls. Every fragment of information painted a picture of a man who had lived with unyielding honor, yet whose life had been marred by one fateful mistake, a mistake that had haunted him long after his body had succumbed to its inevitable decline. I learned that he had once been a respected doctor, a man whose compassion and skill had saved countless lives. But a single misjudgment, a moment of lapse in judgment, had cost him dearly. His fall from grace had been swift and brutal, leaving him with nothing but a legacy of regret and an insatiable desire for atonement. My nightly encounters with Mr. Caldwell grew ever more profound. There were times when I felt the unmistakable touch of a long-lost hand, a gentle caress that spoke of gratitude and forgiveness. On other nights, I found myself overwhelmed by a sense of melancholy so intense that tears streamed down my face, blurring the line between my own suffering and his sorrow. It was as if, in sharing his story with me, he was also offering me a mirror in which to confront my own hidden sorrows, the unresolved pain of losses past, the silent grief of dreams unfulfilled. One evening, as I sat quietly in that secluded room, a sudden chill swept through the space, extinguishing the single candle I had lit in an attempt to ward off the darkness. In the suffocating silence that followed, I sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a palpable change that hinted at a resolution on the horizon. The spectral figure materialized before me in a form more defined than ever before, his eyes now glistening with a clarity that spoke of both despair and hope. With a voice trembling like a fragile whisper, he confided, "I have carried this burden for far too long. I must find the strength to forgive myself, for only then can I truly rest." The admission struck me with an unexpected force. In that moment, I realized that our lives, no matter how seemingly disconnected, are inextricably linked by the shared threads of memory, regret, and the unyielding desire for redemption. I reached out, my hand hovering in the space between us as if to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. "You deserve peace," I murmured softly as tears welled in my eyes. "You deserve to be free of this pain." And though he could not speak, I felt his response in the tender press of his hand against my own, a gesture that conveyed forgiveness, understanding, and a deep, unspoken gratitude. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet of the hospital ward, I began to understand that the boundaries between life and death are not as rigid as we are often led to believe. There are souls who linger behind, caught in the delicate interplay of regret and hope, waiting for someone to notice their silent cries for help. Mr. Caldwell's spirit, once a shadow of despair, had begun to emerge from the darkness, shedding the chains of his past with every whispered confession and every tear I shed on his behalf. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the hospital's oppressive gloom started to lift. I continued to work my shifts, but now there was a newfound lightness in my steps, a subtle assurance that I was part of something greater than myself. The spirit of Mr. Caldwell, though still a mysterious presence, had become a silent companion on my lonely nights. His story, once marred by regret and sorrow, was gradually transforming into one of hope and redemption. In sharing his burden, I discovered not only the profound depths of his suffering, but also the capacity of the human heart to heal even the deepest wounds. I began to see the echoes of his spirit in unexpected places, in the gentle smile of an elderly patient who had once been a friend of his, in the compassionate words of a doctor who believed in second chances, and the quiet determination of a nurse who refused to let despair define her life. Each encounter, each small act of kindness, served as a reminder that even in the midst of overwhelming darkness, there is always a spark of light waiting to be kindled. And so, with every new day, I found solace in the knowledge that my journey was not one of isolation, but of connection, a testament to the enduring power of compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. I kept a diary of our encounters, a detailed chronicle of Mr. Caldwell's spectral visits and my own internal transformation. I wrote of his silent confessions, of the way his eyes would fill with unspoken memories, and of the soft murmur of his voice that seemed to echo through the halls long after he had vanished into the night. Through these words, I attempted to honor a man who had been lost to time, a man whose spirit had been shackled by a lifetime of sorrow. I hoped that by recording his story, I could offer him the redemption he so desperately sought, and in doing so, perhaps also find my own redemption from the burdens of my past. In time, the hospital itself seemed to take on a life of its own, a living, breathing entity that bore witness to countless stories of love, loss, hope, and despair. I began to notice small changes, a faded portrait that now glowed with an almost supernatural warmth, hallways that echoed with laughter and tears in equal measure, and the inexplicable sensation of a gentle presence guiding my steps during the loneliest hours of the night. The ghostly visits, once shrouded in mystery and dread, had gradually become a source of solace, a reminder that even the most broken souls can find a measure of peace when given the chance to be heard. As I continued to unravel the threads of Mr. Caldwell's life, I became increasingly aware that his story was not an isolated tragedy, but a reflection of the countless lives that intersect in unexpected ways. In the sterile confines of a hospital, where human vulnerability is laid bare and the boundaries between joy and sorrow blur into a mosaic of shared experiences, I discovered that healing often comes in the form of understanding, an understanding that transcends the physical and reaches into the deepest recesses of the human soul. And so, night after night, I listened to his quiet laments, allowing his story to seep into my heart like a bittersweet melody, one that resonated with the eternal hope that redemption is always within reach. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the enormity of his sorrow, when the weight of his past seemed too heavy to bear. In those moments, I would close my eyes and imagine him as he once was, a man full of life, ambition, and the simple desire to love and be loved. I remembered the sound of his laughter, the twinkle of his eyes, and the gentle strength that had defined his character before fate intervened. Though his life had been marred by tragedy, there was an undeniable beauty in the way he had faced his demons, a quiet dignity in his relentless pursuit of forgiveness. It was as if his soul was not content to languish in despair, but sought to rise above the pain, to reclaim the fragments of hope that had been scattered by the winds of time. One night, in the twilight hours when the hospital lay silent under a blanket of stars, I found myself alone in that familiar, dimly lit room. The air was thick with anticipation, and I sensed that the moment of reckoning had arrived. As I sat with my journal in hand, the spectral presence of Mr. Caldwell materialized before me with a serenity that belied the turbulent emotions of his past. His eyes, now clear and resolute, met mine, and in that gaze, I saw the final chapter of his long journey, a chapter that was not defined by endless regret, but by the promise of release and the gentle acceptance of his own humanity. "I am ready," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of all the years he had spent in solitude and sorrow. "I have carried the burden of my mistakes for far too long. It is time to let go." In that simple declaration, I felt the culmination of everything we had shared. The hospital seemed to exhale, as if relieved to finally witness the end of a long, agonizing struggle. The oppressive shadows that had once clung to the walls began to recede, replaced by a quiet radiance that spoke of new beginnings and the healing power of forgiveness. I reached out to him one last time, and as my hand touched the cool, intangible air where his presence had been, I felt an overwhelming warmth, a silent acknowledgement of the bond we had forged. In that moment, Mr. Caldwell's spirit began to dissipate, as if carried away by a gentle breeze toward the promise of eternal rest. I watched, tears mingling with a bittersweet smile, as the ghostly figure faded until there was nothing left but the echo of his whispered farewell. The memory of his final words lingered in the room like a benediction, a promise that even in the midst of darkness, redemption is possible, and every soul deserves a chance to be free. In the days that followed, the hospital felt different, a place no longer haunted solely by despair, but imbued with the quiet hope that every life, no matter how troubled, holds the promise of healing. I continued my work with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying with me the lessons learned from Mr. Caldwell's journey. The experience had changed me irrevocably, opening my eyes to the hidden stories behind every patient, every colleague, every fleeting glance exchanged in the sterile corridors. I learned that compassion is not merely a word spoken in moments of crisis, but a lifeline that connects us across the boundaries of life and death. Now, whenever I walk through those same corridors, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a familiar face in the reflection of a window, a gentle reminder of a man who, despite the passage of time and the burden of regret, finally found peace. His spirit, once a ghostly figure wandering the halls in search of solace, has become a part of the hospital's fabric, a silent testament to the enduring power of empathy and the possibility of redemption. And though I continue my nightly shifts, I no longer fear the darkness. Instead, I welcome it as the canvas upon which the stories of countless souls are painted, a tapestry woven from the threads of hope, sorrow, and the unyielding human spirit. In the end, I came to understand that the true miracle of that night lay not in the appearance of a ghost, but in the transformative power of compassion. Mr. Caldwell's story, a story of love lost and redemption sought, taught me that even the most haunted hearts can be healed when we dare to listen to the whispers of the past and embrace the possibility of forgiveness. And so, as the hospital lights flicker softly in the early hours of the morning and the night shift gives way to the promise of a new day, I carry with me the memory of a man who once walked these halls, a man who, in his search for absolution, changed my life forever. My nights are now imbued with a quiet confidence, a deep-seated belief that every soul has a story worth telling, and that every shadow, no matter how dark, holds the potential for light. And in that realization, I find solace, not only for myself, but for all those whose voices are silenced by the passage of time. For in the interplay of memory and hope, in the silent communion between the living and the dead, we discover that redemption is not a distant dream, but a promise that awaits those brave enough to seek it. I remain a humble nurse, a silent witness to the eternal struggle between despair and hope, forever changed by the spirit of an old man whose sorrow was matched only by the depth of his humanity. His journey taught me that even in the face of unspeakable darkness, the human heart has the capacity to heal, to forgive, and ultimately, to find redemption in the quiet moments that bind us all together. And as I continue to walk these corridors, I know that somewhere in the stillness of the night, a gentle spirit lingers, a spirit that reminds me that every ending is but a new beginning, and every whispered goodbye holds within it the promise of eternal peace.